Alright, on this unit we're going to be starting things off with reasoning since we're getting into geometry now. This is going to be about conditional statements, but I did want to go through the warm-up because you do need the ability to solve these kinds of equations through these units. So on this first one, there's nothing to distribute on either of these binomials. So I'm going to go ahead and combine my like terms of x and 2x. That's going to make for 3x. 21 plus 9 is going to make for 30. So 3x plus 30 equals 90. Then I'm going to subtract the 30 on both sides. So 3x will equal 60 and divide by 3. So x will equal 20. On the second equation, you could go about this a couple different ways, but what I'll choose to do is go ahead and distribute the 2 to the 5x. That makes 10x. 2 times 14 is positive 28. Then here I would get the x's together by subtracting 10x from both sides. So that'd be 4x equals 28. Last step would be to divide both sides by 4. So x is equal to 7 would be my answer here. Alright, this lesson is really about how we write definitions and properties and theorems in math. And the way we write those is what's called conditional statements. So a conditional statement is any statement that can be written in if-then form. The part of the statement following the if is known as the hypothesis. You can also hear the condition that you have to meet. The part following the then is the conclusion. You might also hear that called the result, or the application. Now, in math, you might sometimes see hypothesis represented with a P and conclusion represented with a Q whenever you're talking about reasoning. So don't be surprised if ever you see that. I'm just going to use H and C today for the lesson. So in this first example, we're going to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion of the conditional. If today is the first day of fall, then the month is September. Well, my hypothesis would be the complete sentence, today is the first day of fall, with a period. You do need to make it a complete sentence. I will point out the punctuation. Also, you never want to use a pronoun. Here's your subject. Moving on to the conclusion, the month is September. That's the result. Good bit of writing on this lesson. All right. So on this next one, what we're going to do is going to break down each of these statements and make a conditional out of them where I write it in if-then form. So on the first one, an integer that ends with 0 is divisible by 5. The first part of the statement, the subject with any prepositional phrases, is actually going to be your hypothesis. So if an integer ends with 0 is my condition. That's my hypothesis. Then, here's my conclusion. I can use the pronoun it is divisible by 5 is my conclusion. This happens to be a true statement. Not that it asked, but that is true. All right, there's no way that this condition is met without the conclusion being true. All right, for part B, a square has 4 congruent sides. Might be a little bit tricky to know what your subject could be. So I'm going to write if, and I'll call it a shape. You could also use like a figure or something like that. So if a shape is a square. Because they weren't talking about just any old figure. They were actually talking about specifically a square. Then it has 4 congruent sides. Would be my conclusion. And that would be the figure has 4 congruent sides is my conclusion. All right, a conditional can have a truth value of true or false, a statement is assumed to be true unless a counterexample can be provided. Now, we're going to be talking about what counterexamples look like, but assuming a statement is true is actually a pretty tough concept to talk about over a video. That's really something that has to be a conversation, so ask me if you have a question about that. Show that this conditional is false by finding a counterexample. So far we've had true statements. Here's our first false one. If it is February, then there are only 28 days in the month. Now, I can actually come up with a time that it is February, but there are not 28 days in the month. There are 29. That is in leap years. So my counterexample is February has 29 days in leap years would be my counterexample. That's where the condition is being met. The month is February, but the conclusion is not true. Now, on the next part, it's talking about what happens when you switch a hypothesis and conclusion. That's called a converse. A converse of a conditional switches the hypothesis and conclusion. So, when we're looking at this statement, if two lines are not parallel and do not intersect, then they are skew. That happens to be true, by the way, but here's my converse. If two lines are skew, comma, that way the conclusion is now my hypothesis. Then they are not parallel and do not intersect. Is now my conclusion. That happens to be true as well. Now, what I'm going to get into later in the course is this would be an example of a good definition for skew lines, that they are not parallel and do not intersect. That's because one statement implies the other. When both the statement and the converse are both true, that's a good definition. So you might be wondering, what's an example of a bad definition? Well, here, this is a true statement. If a figure is a square, then it has four sides. But saying a figure has four sides is not a good definition for when it's a square. So let's go, while this was true, it said that in the instructions, we're going to write the converse and determine its truth value. So here's my converse. If a figure has four sides, then it is a square. That's my converse because I switched my hypothesis and conclusion. Realize, though, this is actually a false statement. Now, when it is false, you do have to provide a counterexample. So my counterexample that I came up with was a trapezoid. A trapezoid has four sides, but is not a square. So if you were asked to define what a square is and you said a four-sided figure, you would be giving a bad definition because the converse of that statement is false. All right, that wraps up the lesson. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.